All right, hello everyone. Welcome back to CHRTC 309. So, as always, this is Sociology of Youth and Religion. Okay, so following on from what kind of Jean Twenge had to say about the faith of millennials, we're going to move into something slightly different. So here the research is from, it's a little bit more current, right? So it's updated past 2015. Most of the data coming from just before the pandemic, but we'll talk about that in a sec. And this is from a relatively new research institute in the United States called Springtide Institute. And Springtide Institute basically, was founded by a guy named Josh Packard, and he sort of left academia because he wanted to do research on American youth and religion in a way that just wasn't possible inside of the academy for him. So he went off, he founded Springtide Institute, and Springtide, with some private backing, some foundation backing, has been doing some really interesting work on young people and religion. And, whether it's maybe a little bit motivated because they want to please their funders, or whether this is, really the state of American youth and religion, I would say it's a little bit less doom and gloom in a lot of ways than what we've seen from Jean Twenge and from Pew. A little bit more optimistic, but really also kind of qualitatively and quantitatively looking at how young people kind of experience their religious lives in America today. Okay, so the research that Springtide did is a little bit on the small side of a representative sample. They sampled about 1,000 Gen Z Americans in 2019 and asked them about things like their religious identity, right? So, it's not the 6,000 or 10,000 samples that sometimes you get from Pew Research. It's a little bit smaller of a sample, but this is what their breakdown of Gen Z kind of looked like in terms of their religious identities, right? So, 22% identifying as just Christian, right? So these are probably our nons, right? This is our non-denominational Christians. There's some argument, I've seen certain people looking at this same data set and suggesting that the just Christians are people who have had a Christian identity in the past, and just Christian is an identifying phrase that they're using on their way to the exit doors, right? They're going to stop identifying as Catholic or Pentecostal or Baptist or Lutheran or whatever, and they're going to instead, identify as just Christian, right? Rather than something specific. Now, I tend to think that this is probably the growth of the non-denominationals, right? Where people don't think of themselves as even you'll talk to a lot of non-denominational people and they might not think of themselves as Protestant, though their traditions are definitely shaped by Protestantism. So, the just Christians, I think, are nons, right? And what we see, in this particular sample, of Gen Z is that a not unsubstantial percentage of them, almost a quarter, say they are just Christian, followed by 16% who say they're Protestant, 16% who say they're Catholic, which is a little bit, we're talking youth here, that's a little bit below that national number. So I think for Catholics, that should be a concerning number in the US. And then atheists, 8%, nothing in particular, 8%, agnostic, 8%, right? So you're talking, 24% identifying as either atheist, agnostic, or nothing in particular, so no religion, more or less. Fairly consistent, I think, with what we've seen in other number sets. And then something else, that could be a religion not listed. Mormon, 5%, right? So we can add that on to the slight plural or majority who are religious. Muslim 4%, Christian Orthodox or Eastern Orthodox 2%, Jewish or Buddhist 2%, Jewish 2%, Hindu 1%, and then Unitarian, which we won't. Is another kind of religious idea, obviously not a very popular one amongst young people. So this, is kind of the picture of what American youth looked like in kind of 2019 when this survey was done. So a little bit more recent than Twenge. So I think backing up a lot of what Jean Twenge had to say at the end of the day, what we see um, out of Gen Z, according to the Springtide research, is that basically it's very, very individualistic. Okay, so you know, uh, of the young, let's look at a few things. I think in a lot of ways, right? If you look at these numbers that are at the top of the slide, the graphics that Springtime provided, you know, almost 60% of them, of these people ages 13 to 25 told them they don't like to be told answers about faith and religion. They'd rather discover answers on their own. Right, so this is a very individualistic kind of worldview, right? Rather than being interested in how these, old, often very philosophically dense, and certainly, in the case of, say, Catholicism or Protestantism, centuries old or millennia old religious systems have answered questions about, the nature of reality, the nature of God, our relationship to other people, and all those sorts of things. This is a generation that wants to discover these things for themselves, right? They don't want to be told answers. They don't like pat answers. Um, you know, they're deeply disconnected on an institutional level, right? Religious communities, try to fix their problems instead of just being there for them, and they don't like that, right? People want kind of support of them and their journeys. And yeah, only 40% of them say that, of those who say that they're very religious, said they found connecting with their faith communities helpful during uncertain or challenging times. This is Gen Z is a generation of deeply deinstitutionalized people. They're individualistic in their search for answers. They're individualistic in just about everything. They're not that interested in what, say, religious communities might have to say to them. They're more interested in being supported by religious communities. So what I think is almost certain is that one of the signature events of the lives of most Gen Z young people is going to be COVID, right? So in the same way as, millennials in a lot of ways will look to September the 11th, 2001, and the subsequent, war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq, and the so-called war on terror, um, as the kind of signature events that shaped their lives, and potentially for millennials, the 2008, 2009 financial crisis. Almost certainly COVID is going to be one of those major kind of generation shaping events for young people. And so not surprisingly, right, this research, which was published in 2021, was kind of interesting, or I guess they did this research in 2021, was interested in this particular question of, what was happening to young people during COVID in relation to their faith communities. And, what we can say is that, I think owing to probably institutional failure, them not being connected deeply to institutions, and institutions themselves, kind of struggling to help people on an individual level rather than providing kind of group services, but to appeal to people on the individual level. It looks like basically religious communities, faith communities, were a bit of a no-show during the first year of the COVID pandemic, right? And this came as, so let's look at the numbers, right? Like, who reached out to people during COVID, right? Personally, it was 2/3 of them said their friends had, other family, 44%, teachers and professors, like a quarter, coaches, bosses, faith, only 10% said a faith leader had reached out to them during COVID, right? So a pretty small number at the end of the day. Like, I don't want to say catastrophically small, but small, right? 10% is not great. Now, I mean, again, not everybody was connected to a faith community or deeply connected to a faith community. So faith leaders may not have known to reach out to young people, but it's certainly something that didn't seem to happen during COVID for 90% of the young people that Springtide surveyed. Almost, so 57%, almost 60% of the respondents 15 to 25 said to Springtide Institute, STI, that when the pandemic was over, right, so they're kind of mired in the pandemic, they expected a lot would be different, mostly in disappointing ways, right? So they weren't expecting, the world to get back to normal, and they expected things to be kind of bad, and faith communities were certainly not helping with any of that. Okay, yeah, and I mean, churches and other religious institutions are not alone for Gen Z in being places that they don't have a ton of trust in, right? I mean, if you look at these numbers, right, where did people feel safe during the pandemic? School was the best, but still only a third of them, said that they felt safe in school. Or 33% said they felt safe, 29% said they felt safe in school, 22% at work, 22% shopping, 20% in public, only 18% at church, and then other spiritual gatherings, only 11%. So these were not spaces where people felt tremendously safe. And when it came to, when they were feeling overwhelmed and didn't know what to do about something, who would they turn to for help? Do they turn to an institutional source, right? Do they turn to a faith leader or a teacher or someone else to help them? Broadly, no. Most people turn to their friends, right? Half said they turned to their friends. Half said, they turned to their families. And, in terms of, faith communities, 16% said they would turn to someone from their faith communities. And, a lot had lost trust. 57% said it was going to take them time to rebuild the trust that they had lost in institutions and institutional life and all sorts of aspects during COVID, because, when institutions are kind of a no-show for you, or you don't feel safe, and certainly we know in the American and I guess the Canadian context as well, religious organizations were something of a hit and miss in terms of, how well they obeyed the rules around COVID, with prominent examples of religious communities that ignored them altogether. So it was a bit of a hit and miss on the whole. And it was going to take time then for Gen Z to rebuild that trust. So this is an interesting question that Springtide asked. Why, when facing uncertain and difficult times, do you not participate in religious practices or turn to religious communities? Okay, so this is, it's an interesting kind of way of asking a question on a questionnaire. So basically the percentage of young people who agreed with this statement. So, why don't they turn to religious communities when they're facing some kind of struggle? So this says a lot to the attitude of Gen Z with regards to religious communities, right? With regards to how they feel about those communities and what those communities offer to them, right? So 60% of them, almost 2/3, said they don't believe some of the things they hear talked about at religious gatherings, right? So there's an intellectual or probably also emotive kind of distinction they're making, right? Something, and I say emotive, not to diminish it, but because, sometimes this might be as much something they're saying doesn't feel right, like it doesn't align with how they feel. Because again, with millennials and Gen Z, emotion is a guiding principle. They don't like to be told, 58%, they don't like to be told answers about religion, faith and religion. They want to discover it on their own, right? So when facing uncertain times, rather than turning to, say, the wisdom of the ages, I think this is a kind of marker of this generation. People feel like they can find those answers by themselves. They don't need some kind of guide to walk them through it, right? And again, nothing wrong with this. It's just a very distinctly, like, it's not like older generations might have been like, hey, when I'm facing uncertain times of trouble, I'll turn to ancient wisdom, right? The great novels or my faith. They don't want to be told the answers that faith and religion have. They want to discover this. They want to discover answers on their own. Okay, 56% said because other things help me find meaning in life. They don't need a faith community, right? So they're probably not religious nuns for the most part. 55% said they didn't feel like they could be their full selves in a religious organization. And I've heard this a lot kind of anecdotally, right, with young people, especially those struggling with mental illness, feeling like sometimes what's offered by religious communities can be a little bit pat, right? It's like, you're depressed, well, pray more, right? And not getting the kind of help that people may ultimately feel like they need. And so, yeah, I think that makes sense, right? They don't feel like they can be their full selves. They feel like they have to put on a show. Sometimes people criticize religious communities, for being communities where people feel like they have to pretend to be perfect. And that could obviously be alienating for a generation, especially that feels like authenticity is paramount. And that's certainly Gen Z. Religious communities try to fix their problems instead of just being there for them. I guess people here are looking for accompaniment rather than answers. And this is, I think this is something that often people are trying to help, but it doesn't feel like help. It's too action oriented, and people are looking maybe for the equivalent of just someone to sit there, like almost to sit Shiva with them in a particular moment. The sitting Shiva is a Jewish religious practice that happens when someone dies. The community basically sits with them for 7 days. And that seems to be, in a sense, that sense of accompaniment is what Gen Z seems to be looking for here. Religious faith or religious leaders try to give them answers. They're looking for something else. Again, maybe accompaniment or pastoral care of some kind. Religious communities are rigid and restrictive, and that's not helpful. Religious communities are often rules-based, and people may not find that helpful. Half of them said they don't probably have a faith community. They don't know how to get connected with one. So during uncertain times, they wouldn't know where to turn, and probably the last thing on their minds. Other communities, they don't need a faith community, right? So half of them say that other communities do that just fine. They don't need them. So friends, probably school, whatever people belong to. Religion about certainty and doesn't welcome uncertainty, almost half, doubting or asking any questions. So again, this is like religious communities often jumping in and providing too many answers instead of maybe dealing with what the person's actually looking for. And I think this probably speaks poorly to how well potentially pastoral staffs are trained to do a lot of this work, or members of religious communities that feel like they just want to provide answers, and often I think kind of easy answers. Religious gatherings focus on topics that make them uncomfortable. I can't think of I'm sure there are reasons for this. I can't think of an example off the top of my head. They don't think religious or faith leaders will care about the things they want to talk about during times of uncertainty, right? So again, this is people don't feel seen and they want to feel seen. They don't trust religion, faith, or religious leaders in those kinds of organizations. So religion has a bad reputation for 47%. They don't feel safe in religious institutions, right? Fair. This can be for lots of reasons, right? This can be, worries about physical safety. This can, but often it's like, this is more worries about not being able to express identity, or who they really are, and or having ideas that potentially are they see as harmful to them presented, and for Gen Z this is a real problem. They don't feel close enough to anyone that has religion or faith, so they don't know anybody. They wouldn't even know where to begin. So that's 43%. Again, that's something. They have no basis in religion, right? They didn't do anything with religion as a child, and so this is a kind of Steve Brucey type argument. Why would they turn to religion when they haven't needed it or used it until now? So and 39% have been harmed by religion, faith, or a religious leader in the past. So again, that harm can be widely construed. This may be anything from abuse to ideas being presented that hurt them, that made that hurt them emotionally, right? Is important to Gen Z. And 39% wouldn't even think of it because they're just not interested in religion. So or going to a religious institution, right? It's not something they've ever done, and they see no need to start now. Okay, so this is a really interesting chart from Springtide. The reason I think it's interesting is because basically they asked the young people some equivalent of what they thought, what they cared about, what they thought their religious communities cared about, and then they noted the disparity, right? So what you see, broadly speaking, is that Gen Z seems to think that they care about things that their religious communities don't care that much about, or care much less than they do, right? So, where 71% of Gen Zers said that they cared about, LGBTQA plus rights, only 44% of them thought that their religious communities cared about the same things. Same thing with gender equality. 77% of them said they cared about gender equality, but only 52% thought their religious communities cared about it. Immigrant rights or immigration rights, right? Again, 77 to 54 for, a 23% gap. It's statistically big significance there. Income inequality, right? Again, 76% said they cared. Only 53% thought their religious communities cared. Disability rights, 80% cared, but almost 60% thought their religious communities didn't care, or only 60% thought their religious communities did care. Environmental causes, again, we see a 21% gap there. Reproductive rights, so this can be abortion and birth control. Generally, right, they care, but only 54% thought their religious communities cared. Racial justice, right, 81% of them cared. And they only 60% thought that their communities cared. And same with Black Lives Matter. Basically we're seeing, a disparity over 20% for all but Black Lives Matter and gun reform. So big disparities in the way that people saw young people saw what they cared about versus what they thought their religious communities care about. So there's a disjunct there where they care about things, but they think their communities don't care about them. And that's not to say their communities don't care about these things, right? But this is their perception of it, which is important, right? Because if you were part of an organization that you felt had very different values, that would be, I think, quite a difficult thing, right? You wouldn't feel like that organization represented your values very well. Okay, so this is a bit of an odd way of asking this, and I think there's better ways to ask this kind of question. We'll see that when we get to life outcomes, because I think the way that the National Study of Youth and Religion kind of looked at this question was much more scientific. So I don't necessarily love what Springtide did here, although I do think there's definitely some value in it nonetheless. Okay, so flourishing. So basically they asked young people to say, did they feel like they were flourishing in a bunch of different settings? And they basically split their sample between those they listed as very religious and those they listed as not religious at all, and then put the disparity. Now, of course, here's the thing. There's going to be a lot of space in between those two poles, right? There's going to be, very religious and somewhat religious, and the way they've reported this doesn't really tell us all that information. So there's a lot of gray zone here, and I don't want to take this as too definitive, but I think it's interesting nonetheless. Okay, so of the young people that said they were flourishing a lot, right? So what we see basically is between the very religious and not at all religious, across all of these categories, those who said that they were very religious were more likely to say they were flourishing. Now, and I think it's a plurality in most of these cases, right? So like better than a third are saying that they are flourishing in romantic relationships versus less than a quarter for the non-affiliated, for that 14% disparity. Almost half say they're flourishing in friendships, in family relationships, again with double-digit disparities between them and their not at all religious peers. In relationships with trusted adults, right? Big disparity there, 25%, right? Okay. And young people say they're flourishing at work, 20% more than those who are not religious at all. At home, right? A 22% gap, or better than half of those who are very religious say they're flourishing at home. In finances, over a third compared to 14%, right? Less than a fifth um, of the non-religious sample. Physical health and wellness, right? Again, 42%, a 22% gap compared to their non-religious peers. In their mental health, right? The very religious, 42% said their mental health was better. And in their their social and online life, right, 42%. Now, I mean, the thing that I think is worrying here is that only one of these actually breaks across the 50% threshold. So there's a lot of people who don't feel like they're flourishing a lot, right? And again, Springtide doesn't report, flourishing a little. Those would equally be interesting numbers. We just don't have them because they chose not to report them. But we do see, a pretty strong disparity between how much people feel like they're flourishing a lot in these different kind of scenarios. And the more religious young people do seem to be doing better in some ways. And again, this isn't necessarily surprising, right? We've known this from social psychology and from psychology in general. Religion is good for you in lots of ways, right? It provides you a lot of social bonds, right? Going back to Durkheim, we know this about people who are very religious were less likely to take their own lives, right? So we've known this for a long time, that there are psychological and kind of wellness benefits that derive from a religious context. And what we see, that was the same at the end of the 19th century in France, and it's the same today. People who are very religious seem to be doing better than their non-religious peers among Gen Z, at least in certain categories, right? So again, I don't want to be definitive about it because I'm not saying like, hey, everybody go get religion and you'll be just fine. That's obviously, I think, a reductionist. But there does seem to be something where those who say they're very religious are doing a little bit better. And that, in a way, is good news. Okay, so if you look at the kind of readings that are assigned for this week, one of the key readings is, from this study, basically, and it's called, Spotify as a religious metaphor. And from this, basically what Springtide pulls out is a concept that they call faith unbundled. And basically what faith unbundled means, right? So it's a way to describe how Gen Z is constructing their faith lives, right? Now, it's a little bit different from, say, moralistic therapeutic deism. And I got a chance to ask Josh Packard, whether faith unbundled was just moralistic therapeutic deism. And he said no, he doesn't like the concept of moralistic therapeutic deism. He thinks it's way too simplistic and passive, right? So moralistic therapeutic deism is very passive, right? People have this idea that God is kind of easy. And what Packard says is that actually young people take, for the most part, their spiritual and religious lives quite seriously, right? And they work hard at it. And those who have an actual kind of religious or spiritual outlook, they work really, really hard at making it all make sense for them. Okay. So basically what Packard says is, faith unbundled, this is the term that Springtide came up with, is a term that describes the way young people construct their faith by combining elements such as belief, identity, practices, and community from a variety of religious and non-religious sources, rather than receiving all these things from a single tradition, right? So what he says is that Gen Z increasingly, because they're so individualistic, right? Because they're building their faith lives out of not receiving a tradition, but wanting to find those answers themselves, right? So if you think back a couple slides, right, I was talking about how, it's not just what's received, but actually they're looking very, very actively for things that are usable for them, right? So basically what Packard says is that's what they do, right? They combine things. And so one of the things that he said that was interesting, when I listened to him speak, is he was very surprised because he thought that what he would find was that, it would be either the rosary or tarot cards, right? The young people would make a kind of choice between, say, a Catholic practice like praying the rosary or, a New Age practice like using tarot cards. But what he said is this actually isn't really the way that it works. In fact, he says it's often a kind of both and for Gen Z, is they will take from the available material what is there, right? So they'll take the rosary, a practice they find meaningful, and they'll take tarot cards, a practice they find meaningful, and maybe transcendental meditation from Buddhism, or a kind of mindfulness from sort of kind of like pop psychology background. And they will actually take those things and combine them into their own sense of kind of religion and spirituality that's completely different, say, and unique compared to what was available to them. So, I mean, here you could be maybe thinking a little bit of Thomas Luckman's concept of invisible religion, right? Religion itself is becoming individualized, where people are picking and choosing elements. Now, this is not necessarily meaning that people have very, very formed and very, very deep kind of religious thoughts or traditions, right? When you're grabbing from the available materials, it is kind of, you get what you get. And that's, that's okay. But yeah, I mean, today young people not relying on a single institution to make sense of their identity makes sense given how deinstitutionalized they are. They engage with communities, they outline, the boundaries of belief and offer practices that mark significant life moments where they're taking all of these from anywhere that they can get them. And right, for them, for Gen Z, what Packard says, and I think this makes sense, religion isn't a closed system, but an open system that flows in and out of other systems, science, ecology, socialization, politics, and especially through relationships. Gen Z is highly relational in their thinking. And so what they really care about is where can they find meaningful relationships that kind of help them. Okay, so what does it mean then to unbundle religion or faith from a single source? So what Packard says and what Springtide says is that this looks like curiosity, right? So in order to kind of make meaning, right, and discern what they believe about right, wrong, the purpose of the universe, their calling, salvation, what does it mean to suffer? Why do we suffer? Right? They're drawing from all sorts of traditions. And this makes sense, right? This is a generation that has access to information like no other generation before did, right? You have the supercomputer in your pocket that allows you to access both amusing cat pictures, and more information than you can consume in 10 lifetimes, right? And so there is the possibility of being curious and looking to other religious systems. And so there is, I think, a deep syncretism built into Gen Z, right? Now, it's not always coherent, right? And this is where I think a lot of people who come from traditional religious institutions are often kind of leery about something like Faith Unbundled or the way Gen Z approaches religion and faith and any kind of system. It is that because they're not drawing from a single system, it's not always tremendously coherent, right? It is very, very instrumental, right? So it is not what makes sense necessarily on a, kind of philosophical or like following the rules of logic kind of system, but what makes sense for me, right, as an individual, what it resonates with me, what practices from this religion and that religion work for me. And so in that way, right, it is tremendously different from kind of what came before it. And I think that can be hard for people raised in different times, and certainly whose concept of religion and faith and all of these things is much more rigidly within the bounds of an identity, right? To be Catholic means having certain practices. But, unbundling belief from a single source is curiosity, right? What has been said out there that's meaningful to me? And I think that's the Gen Z outlook kind of in a nutshell. Unbundling identity from a single system. There is this sense in Gen Z, right, of discovering who you are, that you have this identity and kind of uncovering your identity, who you truly are on the inside is what you need to do to feel whole, right? To feel at peace with yourself, right? There's a real stress in Gen Z on acceptance, on bringing your whole self, on authenticity, right? Authenticity is a huge kind of point for Gen Z. So what Packard says, and I think he's right here, is that unbundling identity from a single source or system young people, they're unwilling to shed parts of themselves, right, to fit into pre-prescribed narratives. And a lot of, religious traditions are pre-prescribed narratives, right? What does it mean to be Catholic? What does it mean to be Anglican? What does it mean to be, evangelical or Jewish or Muslim? For a lot of Gen Z, that question really doesn't work that well for them because they're unwilling to leave a part of themselves, right? If they are kind of struggling with different identities, right? Or they're LGBTQ, right? They wouldn't want to sublimate that to fit into a religious tradition because, or there could be a whole lot of other things, right? Not just LGBTQ, but other parts of who they are. They don't want to leave those things at the door, right? They're committed to a kind of sense of wholeness, right? They want to bring their whole self into everything they do and not have to bifurcate themselves or sublimate themselves, right? And so I think in a lot of ways, you can see this as very postmodern, right? And even post-Freudian, its kind of orientation, right? That, part of for Freud being civilized, in his words, not mine, is about sublimating urges and parts of yourself that don't fit with civilization. And so, having kind of unearthed that or made that part of the common vocabulary, then the post-Freudian project becomes about liberating all of those urges that were sublimated in order to build civilization, right? And Freud talks about this kind of in Civilization and its Discontents. There's also a very therapeutic aspect to it, right? So I think it fits with this, as much as I know Josh Packard doesn't love moralistic therapeutic deism as a concept, I think this idea of wholeness is about a kind of therapeutic nature, right? That Gen Z is very much brought up in a therapeutic world, right? A world where it is, you need to be at peace with yourself and everything is about making you feel good about yourself. Sublimating or cutting parts of yourself off doesn't feel good. Anyone who's ever tried to tamp down something that they deeply cared about will understand that that doesn't feel very good, right? And this is something that Gen Z can't abide. So for them, right, unbundling their identity from single sources is I can't fit myself into your box. Your box is going to have to get big enough to fit me in it, right? And they want to bring their whole selves, not be fit into an ideology or a doctrinal system or anything like that. Unbundling community from a single source or system, right? Young people, Packard says, show up where trusted personal relationships exist, right? So where do they have relationships, right? It doesn't have to be, if you grew up Catholic, it doesn't have to be in a Catholic church. You're gonna go where relationships are, right? And people who trust and seem kind and are treating you in that wholeness kind of way, right? And who foster your curiosity. So yeah, I mean, they'll forgo participating in communities where they don't see these qualities, right? Where they don't see kind people who will take them as they are. One of the things that Packard says is Gen Z, for lots of reasons, is a generation that's very much looking for connection, right? Especially connection with mentors, which is something that in a lot of cases, whether it be COVID or just the socially disconnected way they've lived because of smartphones, they're really in need of mentorship and they're looking for it, right? So they're looking for connection. Communities are connection and they want to go where those connections are. And practices, what does it look like to unbundle practices from a single system? It looks like young people who blend and adapt various kind of rituals, right? They're going to take the rosary, they're going to take Reiki, they're going to take meditation, and make it in a way that suits the current questions they're facing or the challenges that come up, right? What is working for them now, right? It's a very flexible ideological and faith-based system that they're using to fit themselves, right? They live in a very chaotic world with a lot of inputs and a lot of challenges. And what it seems like Gen Z is looking for, at least according to Packard, and they did these 1,000 questionnaires and 100 interviews, and this is where they came to these conclusions, is that they're looking for something that works, that makes sense of their lives, that lets them be who they are, that connects them with other people, and that they can be flexible enough to adopt and cast away things as they need, right? And I mean, this I think fundamentally is also driven by pluralism. They know a lot of people from a lot of different faith traditions, and they see that some of those faith traditions or non-faith traditions work for those people, and they're like, I'm going to bring in whatever works, right? I'm going to try whatever works to make my life better, because fundamentally there's a lot of suffering in Gen Z. There's a lot of loneliness. There's a lot of, mental illness, as kind of Twenge lays out. And they're looking for stuff that works, right? And if something doesn't work, it's off, right? It's cast off. They're, I mean, in a sense, I think not a very patient generation, but one that is looking for, practices and things that work for them that make their lives better at the end of the day. So this is faith unbundled, right? It's kind of like Spotify. You only get, you're not talking about whole albums anymore. You're getting all the songs you like so that like it's like your mix on, Spotify, or your year in review. I can't remember what it's called, where Spotify at the end of the year tells you all of your favorite songs and sort of suggests what that says about you in a certain way, right? That's kind of faith unbundled, right? It's like, people are going to take whatever they want, the little bits and pieces that fit their lives, and shape that into a spiritual and faith life that really makes sense for them in ways that I think are hard for older generations to understand. Certainly even me, I'm an older millennial, and at moments this to me trips me up, because I've always thought of kind of religious and spiritual identities as having these really firm boundaries. And Gen Z seems to be blowing that up a little bit, right? Where it's like Catholic but Reiki, Catholic but tarot, Catholic but transcendental meditation, or centering prayer, right, which is a Buddhist practice. A lot of pushback, from people who are purists in these kind of religious systems. But it is an interesting kind of phenomenon, right? It's a generation where now they have access to all of these practices, and I mean, you can watch a YouTube video on connecting prayer and kind of get into the practice, or Kabbalah, or anything you want. And that's what Gen Z is doing, right? And building a life of spirituality and faith outside of strict identity and ideological boxes, but in ways that I think are truly fascinating.